Hello, welcome back to another video. Today's case is about a conman serial killer, because why be one or the other, right? Go big or go home. In January 1915, Detective Inspector Arthur Neal received a letter that would lead to one of the most infamous murder cases in English history. The letter was from Joseph Crossley, who owned a boarding house in Blackpool, and inside the letter had two clippings. One was a newspaper clipping about Margaret Lloyd, who was found dead in the bath by her husband John Lloyd. The other clipping was a coroner's report about Alice Smith, who was also found dead in the bath by her husband George Smith. Detective Inspector Neal saw the similarities between the two deaths and decided to investigate. On the 17th of December 1913, D.I. Neal went to 14 Bismarck Road, which is where the Lloyds had lived before Margaret Lloyd had drowned in the bath. He looked over the bath and he couldn't believe that a grown woman had drowned in it. It was too small and narrow, and the bath wasn't full when she was found. He looked over the coroner's report, but there was no signs of violence on her either, so he just became more suspicious. D.I. Neal found out that 3 hours before Margaret Lloyd died, she'd made a will, and her husband was the sole beneficiary. She'd also taken out her life savings too. Alice Smith had also recently got life insurance, and her husband was the sole beneficiary of that too. D.I. Neal wondered if John Lloyd and George Smith might just be the same person. To test his theory, D.I. Neal set up a trap for John Lloyd. He asked the coroner inspecting Margaret Lloyd's body to send through a report to the insurance company. He knew this would make John Lloyd go to his lawyer's office. He sat outside his lawyer's office and waited for John Lloyd to turn up. On February the 1st, 1915, a man matching descriptions of both John Lloyd and George Smith turns up to the lawyer's office. D.I. Neal approaches him and asks him if he is George Smith. The man refuses to admit that he is, but D.I. Neal knows he's got his man, so he takes him in for questioning on suspicion of bigamy. But from there, the story takes a much darker turn. But let's start from the beginning. George Joseph Smith was born in Bethnal Green, London in January 1872. He was the son of an insurance agent. He enjoyed things like Shakespeare, piano and poetry, but he was also a bit of a tearaway. He was sent at the age of 9 to a reformatory in Gravesend in Kent, and he would stay there until he was 16 years old for swindling and theft. In 1891 he was jailed for the first time as an adult for theft, and it's thought that whilst there he learnt a lot from his inmates, such as committing fraud and using false identities. In 1896 he was imprisoned again for a year for persuading a woman to steal from her employers, but he did take that money and used it to open a baker's shop in Leicester, and that's where he employed and later married Caroline Thornhill. Later they moved to London, where Caroline started stealing from her various employers, under the tuition of George, of course. But she was eventually caught trying to pawn some spoons, and she was sent to prison for a year. George, on the other hand, disappeared. George didn't quite disappear, he just went and found another wife and started extorting money from her instead. But it wouldn't be long before Caroline got her revenge. On her release from prison in 1900, she actually saw George in the street by chance in London. She called the police and got him imprisoned for 2 years. In 1903, George is released from prison and he is hell-bent on getting revenge on Caroline. But when he goes looking for her, her brothers find him first and they give him a good beating. Meanwhile, Caroline moves to Canada. George then goes back to his second wife, clears out all her savings and disappears. In June 1908, Smith meets a widow called Florence Wilson. 3 weeks later they get married. By the July, he's cleared out her savings and taken all of her belongings. Don't know if you've noticed by now, but George is not good people. Yes, it is April and I am drinking from a Christmas mug. Still in 1908, George meets and marries Edith Pegler. She replied to his advert for housekeeper. There's something about Edith you'll see throughout. She's the one that he never truly leaves. He always goes back to her with money and clothes. Then in 1909, he meets and marries Sarah Freeman, steals all her money, disappears again. You get the pan. Then on the 10th of August 1910, George, under the name of Henry Williams, meets Bessie Mundy, a 33-year-old spinster, which I take offence to. I mean, maybe she just had standards. I mean, she did marry a serial killer, but at least he wasn't boring. The reason George wanted to marry Bessie was because she had £2,500 inheritance. But after marrying her, what he realised was that inheritance was in a trust fund held by her family, so he wasn't getting his hands on that anytime soon. He did persuade Bessie to hand over £150 of cash savings that she had, but that wasn't enough for George, so he disappeared again. But he just couldn't get the thought of that £2,500 inheritance off his mind. 18 months later, Bessie just happens to see George out walking. He tells her he's been searching for her this entire time and wanted her back. He said the reason that he left was because he had a venereal disease which he didn't want her to catch, so he just left. Of all the excuses, why pick that one? But Bessie didn't care. She took him back and they got back together. George suggested, and we know George's suggestions by this point, that they both draw up mutual wills, so if one died, the other one would receive their inheritance. Now, George would receive £2,500 from Bessie if she died, but Bessie would get nothing because George didn't have anything. But she agreed to it and they drew up wills. In July 1912, they moved to Kent, where George set himself up as an art dealer. He made sure he bought a bath for the home, which Bessie helped him choose. George took Bessie a few times to the doctors and explained that she was having fits. Bessie also wrote to her family to explain that she'd had a few fits, but that her husband was looking after her well. What her husband was actually doing was laying the foundations, so that if Bessie happened to die later as a result of a fit, it wouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. On the morning of the 13th of July, the doctor was called to the home. Bessie had had a fit and died in her bath. The doctor knew of her medical history, so signed it off and decided that no post-mortem was required. George arranged for Bessie to have a pauper's funeral and she was buried in a common grave. When he went to the estate agents to tell them that he was moving, he said, "Wasn't it a jolly good job I got her to make a will?" And then guess where he went? Back to Edith Pegler. Not the type to grieve for long, George met Alice Burnham in 1913. They met at a chapel service and were married within the week. He got her to make a will where he was the beneficiary, managed to get £100 of her savings and insured her life for £500, as you do. They went to Blackpool on their honeymoon and found accommodation with a bathroom at Mrs. Crossley's. George took Alice to the doctors saying that she'd had an epileptic fit, but Alice was only complaining of headaches. Alice also wrote to her family to say that she had a few headaches, but she had the best husband in the world. On the evening of the 12th of December, the landlady saw water trickling through the ceiling, so she ran upstairs and found George holding his wife's head above water in the bath, screaming for her to get a doctor because his wife was dead. George ordered for a pauper's funeral and claimed on the life insurance. He decided he was going to return again to Edith Pegler. As he was leaving, the landlady shouted out the window, "Crippen!" which Crippen is in relation to the famous murderer at the time, Dr. Crippen, who killed his wife. In September 1914, George marries again, this time to a poor servant girl. He takes what little she has, steals her wedding clothes, goes back to Edith Pegler and gives them to her, claiming that he'd been dealing in second-hand clothes recently. In December 1914, George meets Margaret Lofty, a 37-year-old daughter of a clergyman who's been living with her mother and sister in Bristol. They make several visits to a local solicitor to arrange life insurance, and one day Margaret leaves the family home and never returns. She's run off with George to get married. She hands over what little money she has to him and writes to her family saying she's married a thoroughly Christian man. They travel to London and stay in lodgings in Highgate. The landlady hears splashing and runs upstairs. She hears George shouting for her to fetch a doctor. She does so, and when the doctor arrives, Margaret is dead. Margaret died one day after she was married to George. The doctor certified that Margaret had died from a combination of a hot bath and the flu. The hot bath had made her faint and she'd drowned. George arranged for a pauper's funeral and she was buried in a common grave. He then went back to Edith Pegler and spent Christmas with her and her family in Bristol. So now we're back on the timeline, and George Smith has just been arrested by D.I. Neal on charges of bigamy and later murder. D.I. Neal knew he had a killer on his hands, but he couldn't prove how these women had died. There was no signs of violence on their bodies. To get to the truth, renowned pathologist Bernard Spilsbury was put on the case. He was in charge of exhuming the bodies and deciding if these women had been drowned by force. For weeks, Spilsbury tried to work out how these women had died. There was no evidence of heart disease. It wasn't epilepsy. There was no poison found in the bodies. It was as if they'd died instantaneously, like a stroke. Spilsbury suggested to D.I. Neal that they run some experiments. They got a bath similar to one that the women had died in, and got some female officers to participate. They tried holding the women under the water in the bath, but they were able to fight back. After trying to push the women under the water by their shoulders, they realised it was too difficult. They were putting up too much of a struggle. Then D.I. Neal unexpectedly pulled one of the women by their legs. She immediately went under the water and lost consciousness. In fact, it took them 30 minutes to revive her. This helped prove Spilsbury's theory that George had drowned his wives. On the 22nd of June, George's trial began at the Old Bailey. George refused to give evidence himself. I think either because he was supremely confident he'd get off, or because he was worried he might trip himself up. D.I. Neal demonstrated to the jury their theory that George had pulled his wives by the legs in order to drown them, and can you believe the person he demonstrated on, again, lost consciousness and nearly died? I can't believe how blasé they were about doing these tried and tested murder moves on their own staff. The prosecution argued that George, ever the charmer, will have just wandered into his wife's bathrooms whilst they were in the bath. He will have approached them and very quickly grabbed them by the legs and pulled, submerging their heads under the water, resulting in a sudden lack of consciousness, hence the reason why there were little signs of drowning and little signs of any violence to their bodies. George strongly denied murder throughout the trial and made several outbursts to the jury. My favourite one was, "I am not a murderer, although I may be a bit peculiar." Peculiar is putting it lightly, George. George was confident he'd get off, but he did lose his temper from time to time. He shouted at the jury that he could not be charged with murder and he could not be sentenced to death. It took the jury just 20 minutes to decide that George was guilty, and on the 1st of July, George was sentenced to hang, and the confidence visibly drained from his face. George Joseph Smith was hanged on the 13th of August 1915 by hangman John Ellis. On the morning of his execution he was a wreck. He was led shaking to the trapdoor, which he stood over, and the hood was placed over his head as he shouted, "I'm innocent." He denied his crimes to the end. Caroline, if you remember her, George's first wife, was still his lawful wife. She attended the execution, probably to see George finally getting what he deserved. The day after his execution, she married a Canadian soldier. In total, George entered into 7 bigamous marriages between 1908 and 1914. But what was it about him? It wasn't so much that George was handsome. It was more that he had a hypnotic, masterful way with women. One of the women he married said that the power lay in his eyes. But it was also said that George had an arrogance that irritated any man he met. One of his bride's fathers described his eyes as looking like a mad dog's. But I think mostly that he lived in a period when there were more women than men. The women had had fathers who had made them a lot of money, so they had everything they wanted, apart from a husband. So when someone charismatic and hypnotic like George came along, they immediately wanted to marry him. And that's how he accomplished what he did. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please hit like and subscribe. I've got plenty of videos planned and I'd love for you to stick around to see them. Have a great day, and if you decide to have a bath, maybe just lock the door, just in case. See you later.